Story number 1.
The wind rattled the old wooden windows of the farmhouse, a sound that Mary had grown accustomed to since she moved there 3 months ago. She had inherited the house from her grandmother, a stoic woman with a love for isolation and quiet. It was a charming place during the day, with sprawling fields and the smell of wildflowers, but at night the charm turned sour and an unsettling aura settled over the home. Mary tried to dismiss it at first. It was an old house. Old houses made noises. But the peculiarities began to mount. Doors would creak open on their own despite her locking them. A faint scent of lavender would waft through the air in the evenings, though there were no flowers nearby. And then there was the sound, soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom that stopped just short of her door. She convinced herself it was her imagination until the night she heard the voice. It was around 2 a.m. when she woke to the distinct sound of someone humming. The melody was unfamiliar but hauntingly beautiful, each note lingering in the still air like a memory. Mary froze in her bed, her heart pounding. The sound was faint, but it was undeniably coming from the direction of the kitchen downstairs. Grabbing her phone for light, she tiptoed toward the staircase. The humming stopped the moment she reached the top step. The silence that followed was oppressive. Mary held her breath, listening intently. But the house seemed to hold its own, stifling her courage with its unyielding quiet. When she finally worked up the nerve to descend the stairs, she found nothing out of place in the kitchen. Everything was as it should be, except for a single teacup sitting on the counter. She hadn't used it. In the days that followed, the humming became more frequent. It would start at random times, always soft and melodic, but never accompanied by footsteps or any sign of movement. Mary began to question her sanity. She told herself it was stress, that the isolation was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. One night, determined to prove to herself that she was imagining things, Mary set up her phone to record as she slept. She positioned it on her nightstand, pointed at the bedroom door, and let it run until morning. When she woke up, the first thing she did was check the footage. At first, it seemed normal. The video showed her sleeping soundly, the only movement coming from the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. But then, at 3:14 a.m., the door opened on its own. Slowly, almost cautiously, it swung inward, revealing nothing but the dark hallway beyond. And then a shadow appeared. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was taller, thinner, with an unnatural shape that seemed to shift as it moved. The shadow glided into the room and stopped at the foot of Mary's bed. It lingered there for several minutes, completely still, before retreating back into the hallway and closing the door behind it. Mary stared at the screen in disbelief, her hands trembling. The logical part of her mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a glitch or a trick of the light, but she knew better. Whatever that thing was, it had been in her room while she slept. That night, she didn't bother trying to sleep. Instead, she sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, her phone clutched in her hand, ready to call for help if anything happened. The hours dragged by in tense silence until just past midnight, the humming began again. This time it was louder, clearer, as though whoever or whatever was humming wanted to be heard. The sound seemed to echo through the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mary's pulse raced as she stood up, clutching a kitchen knife she had grabbed earlier for protection. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The humming stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, from the top of the stairs, a voice answered. It was soft, almost a whisper, but chilling in its clarity. "Come upstairs." Mary's blood turned to ice. She stood frozen in place, her mind screaming at her to run, to get out of the house, but her legs refused to move. The voice called out again, this time more insistent. "Come upstairs, Mary." Hearing her name snapped her out of her paralysis. She bolted for the front door, flinging it open and running into the night without looking back. She didn't stop until she reached her car parked at the edge of the driveway. Fumbling with the keys, she jumped in and locked the doors, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. She spent the night in a nearby motel, unable to bring herself to return to the house. The next morning, she called a local historian, desperate to learn more about the property. What she discovered only deepened her fear. The farmhouse had belonged to her grandmother for decades, but before that, it had been the home of a family who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The mother, father, and 2 children were never found, and the only clue was a single teacup left on the kitchen counter. Mary never returned to the farmhouse. She sold it within weeks, leaving behind all of her grandmother's belongings. But even after she moved to a new city, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching her. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she could hear it, the faint sound of humming, drifting through the air like a ghostly lullaby. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I moved into the old house on Baker's Hollow during the middle of winter. The rent was suspiciously cheap, but as a grad student barely scraping by, I couldn't afford to be picky. The house was built in the early 1900s with creaky wooden floors, cracked plaster walls, and a faint musty smell that clung to every room. The landlord, a wiry man in his 70s, had been brief during our meeting, handing me the keys without much small talk. "Just don't go into the basement," he muttered before hurrying off. At first, I didn't think much of it. The basement was locked, and I assumed it was just filled with old junk or perhaps in such bad condition that it was unsafe. The first few weeks were uneventful. My days were spent juggling classes and late-night study sessions. But as the snow piled up outside, the house grew colder and eerier. It started with sounds. At night, when the wind howled outside, I'd hear faint creaks and groans from the floorboards. I chalked it up to the house settling. Then came the knocking, 3 sharp raps, always at 3:15 a.m. At first, I thought it was my overactive imagination, the stress of school manifesting as paranoia, but it kept happening like clockwork every single night. One night, I mustered up the courage to check the front door when the knocking started. Nothing. Not a footprint in the snow, not a shadow in sight. Things escalated when I began finding my belongings moved around. My keys, which I always left on the kitchen counter, would be on the coffee table. My textbooks would be pulled off the shelf and stacked neatly on my desk, even though I knew I hadn't touched them. Once I came home to find every cabinet door in the kitchen wide open. I convinced myself I was just being careless, but the unease lingered. I started leaving the lights on at night and sleeping with a small knife under my pillow. Then came the dreams. I started having vivid nightmares of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, its face obscured but its presence suffocating. In the dreams, it would point toward the basement door, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of those whispers lingering in my ears. One evening, as I was studying at the dining room table, the lights flickered and went out. I grabbed my phone for light and stumbled toward the fuse box, which, of course, was in the basement. I hesitated, remembering the landlord's warning, but the darkness felt oppressive. I had no choice. The basement door was heavy and resisted as I pushed it open. The air that wafted out was damp and smelled faintly of rot. Using my phone's flashlight, I descended the creaking stairs, each step amplifying the growing sense of dread in my chest. The basement was mostly empty, save for a few old boxes and a rusty metal chair in the corner. The fuse box was on the far wall. As I made my way over, my light caught something carved into the wall. Symbols, jagged and erratic, like they'd been etched in a hurry. I couldn't make sense of them, but they filled me with an inexplicable sense of unease. When I reached the fuse box, I flipped the main breaker, and the lights came back on. Relieved, I turned to head upstairs, but froze. The chair, which had been in the corner, was now in the middle of the room, facing me. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and my mind was a mess of confusion and fear. I didn't sleep that night, jumping at every creak and shadow. The next day, I called the landlord. When he answered, I demanded to know what was wrong with the house. There was a long pause before he sighed. "Look," he said, "I didn't want to scare you, but the house has a history." He explained that years ago, a man named Samuel had lived there. Samuel had been a recluse, rarely leaving the house. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises, chanting mostly, late into the night. One day, the mailman noticed Samuel hadn't collected his mail in weeks. When the police entered the house, they found Samuel dead in the basement. He had apparently taken his own life, but what they couldn't explain were the symbols carved into the walls and floor around him. The police wrote it off as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but the locals believed Samuel had been trying to summon something, or worse, keep something trapped. I wanted to leave right then and there, but I had no money and nowhere else to go. So I stayed, despite the landlord's half-hearted apology and assurance that the activity was probably harmless. That night, the knocking came again, louder this time, and with it came a voice, low and gravelly, whispering my name. Lily! I froze, clutching the knife under my pillow. The voice continued, insistent and desperate. Lily, help me! Summoning what little courage I had, I called out, What do you want? The whispering stopped, replaced by silence so profound it was deafening. Then the basement door creaked open. I knew I shouldn't go down there. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But something stronger compelled me, a morbid curiosity or perhaps the faint hope that if I confronted whatever this was, it would leave me alone. The basement was colder than before, the air heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. In the center of the room, the chair faced me once again, and sitting in it was the shadowy figure from my dreams. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze pierce through me. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the room, it spoke. You have to finish what he started. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure raised an arm, pointing to a box in the corner. Trembling, I walked over and opened it. Inside were papers covered in Samuel's frantic scrawl, notes, diagrams, and more of those strange symbols. Among them was a journal, its last entry reading, The seal is weakening. If no one reinforces it, it will break free. I realized with dawning horror what Samuel had been doing. He hadn't been summoning anything. He had been trying to contain it. Before I could react, the basement door slammed shut and the lights went out. The glow from the symbols intensified, illuminating the figure as it rose from the chair and began advancing toward me. I screamed, fumbling for my phone to light the way, but it was dead. The air grew icy and the whispers returned, now a cacophony of voices overlapping and echoing in my mind. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure stopped, mere inches from me. It raised a hand, and in the dim glow of the symbols, I saw its face, or lack thereof. It was a void, featureless and endless. You must seal it, the voices hissed, before it's too late. I don't remember how I got out of the basement. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my car, gripping Samuel's journal like a lifeline. I drove away from the house and never went back. I later learned that the house had been abandoned before the landlord bought it, left to rot for decades. The locals said anyone who stayed too long would either leave in the dead of night or disappear altogether. To this day, I don't know if I did the right thing by leaving. Sometimes I dream of the house, the basement, and the shadowy figure. And in those dreams, the whispers return, always the same. It's getting stronger.
Story number 3.
It was just supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of my job and city life. My friend Sarah had found an old cottage in the woods that seemed like the perfect escape, isolated, rustic, and peaceful. I'd always loved nature, so when she suggested it, I was excited. The place was advertised as a cozy, historic retreat, but there were a few oddities that we only discovered after arriving. The cottage was small but charming, with a wood-burning stove and old furniture that gave it a sense of timelessness. The forest surrounding it was thick and dense, the kind of woods that seemed to stretch on forever, with barely any sunlight making its way through the canopy above. We both loved it at first, walking through the woods, sitting by the fire, cooking meals in the kitchen. But after the first night, something felt off. It started with little things, sounds in the walls at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old buildings creak and groan, and I've spent enough time in old houses to know that sounds like these are common. But there was something different about this place. The sounds weren't just the usual pops and creaks. They felt deliberate, like something was moving, pacing. On our second night there, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a noise that made my heart race, scratching. It started faintly, but it grew louder, closer. It was coming from somewhere in the walls. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something trapped in the attic, but it didn't sound like that. It sounded more like nails dragging across wood, slowly, methodically. I nudged Sarah awake, and she heard it too. "It's probably a tree branch scraping the side of the house," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I agreed, but neither of us could fall back to sleep. We lay there, listening to the scratching until it finally stopped. The next morning, we went about our day, dismissing the noise as nothing more than the house settling. But as we walked through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just outside my line of sight. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Later that evening, as the sun set, Sarah suggested we take a walk by the nearby lake. It was a quiet, serene spot, and we thought it would help us shake off the unease we were both feeling. As we reached the shore, Sarah pointed out something in the distance, a figure standing in the trees on the far side of the lake. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but as we watched, the figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, standing perfectly still, its back turned to us. It looked like a person, but something about the way it stood was unsettling. It was as if it wasn't even aware we were there. "Let's go back," I said, my voice trembling. Sarah hesitated but agreed. We turned around and walked briskly back to the cottage, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the distance. That night, the noises were worse than before. The scratching grew louder, followed by what sounded like muffled whispers, too faint to make out but unmistakable. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even breathe. Sarah slept soundly beside me, unaware of the growing tension in the room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. The isolation, the quiet, the strange feeling I'd gotten from the lake, it had all added up, making me anxious. But as the whispering continued, I knew I wasn't alone in that house, and whatever was there wasn't friendly. Around 4 a.m., I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. They were coming from the hallway just outside our door. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of the air in the room, thick with something unexplainable. I grabbed my phone and texted Sarah, but she didn't wake up. The footsteps stopped at the door, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the door handle turned slowly, as though someone on the other side was testing it. I was frozen, unable to move or make a sound. The door creaked as the handle twisted again, but it didn't open. The footsteps retreated down the hall, but the sound of something dragging along the floor followed them, growing closer. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, to wake Sarah, but I couldn't make a sound. I kept my eyes on the door, praying that whatever it was would just leave. Then, to my horror, I heard the voice. It was low, a rasping whisper, and it came from just outside the door. "Come closer," it said. "I'm waiting." The door shook as if something was pressing against it from the other side. I could hear the scraping again, only this time it was on the door itself, dragging against the wood like nails on a chalkboard. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I grabbed Sarah's arm and shook her awake. She groggily blinked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" "Sarah, we need to leave. Now," I whispered urgently. Her eyes darted to the door, and for the first time, she seemed to understand that something was terribly wrong. We didn't bother with packing. We grabbed our bags and ran out the front door, not stopping until we reached the car. I don't remember how long it took us to drive back to town, but I remember looking in the rearview mirror and seeing the dim outline of the cottage in the distance. The lights inside were flickering, and there was something standing at the window, an indistinct shape watching us leave. We stayed in a motel that night, too shaken to go back to the cottage. The next morning, we called a local historian, hoping to find out more about the place. When we told him where we had stayed, he went quiet for a long moment before speaking. "That cottage has a history," he said. "It was built over the site of an old farmhouse. Many years ago, a family lived there, a mother, a father, and their daughter. The father went missing one winter, and after that, the mother and daughter were never seen again. The locals say the house was cursed. People who've stayed there reported strange noises, whispers, and figures watching them. Some say the spirits of the family still haunt the place." My blood ran cold as he spoke. It sounded exactly like what we'd experienced. And then I realized The figure by the lake, the one we had seen standing in the trees, it wasn't just some wanderer. It was them, the family. We never went back to that cottage. It still stands, abandoned and forgotten, though I often wonder who or what might still be there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was the kind of house that people drive by and admire from the outside, the kind that makes you wonder about its history. The old farmhouse sat on the edge of town, surrounded by a vast field that had long since stopped being farmed. The once bright red paint had faded to a dull pink, and the wood on the porch had warped and splintered with age. Still, it held an undeniable charm, even as the weeds overtook the yard and the windows gathered dust. Jessie had always been drawn to the house. As a child, she would ride her bike past it and wonder about the family that lived there. When she grew older, she learned it had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Rumor had it that the house was haunted. People talked about strange sounds at night, shadows moving in the windows, and strange lights flickering from the upstairs rooms. Jessie, however, dismissed it all as nonsense. She wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, not after years of living in a world of logic and science. But when her parents mentioned that they were moving to a new town, Jessie found herself alone in that house one chilly evening, awaiting the moving truck with nothing but time to kill. Her parents had already left for their new home, and Jessie had stayed behind to pack the last of her things. The house felt strangely still. It was eerily quiet, even for an old place like this. The sun had long since set, and the house grew darker by the minute. Jessie, trying to shake off the unease, decided to explore. She'd always thought the place was beautiful in its own decaying way. The wooden floors creaked under her feet, and the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. She wandered from room to room, taking it all in for what she thought might be the last time. In the living room, an old fireplace stood cold, its stone hearth cracked. A faded rug lay in the center of the room, and there were bits of broken furniture strewn about. The kitchen was no different. Cabinets half open, drawers askew, dishes left unwashed. And then she found the stairs. They led to the second floor, a place she'd only ever glimpsed from the bottom. The railing was chipped, and the stairs creaked under her weight, each step sounding like a warning. But Jessie wasn't afraid. She knew the stories. She knew the rumors. She had to see it for herself. At the top of the stairs, she was met with a hallway lined with doors, each one different, each one more mysterious than the last. Most of the doors were ajar, showing nothing but darkness behind them. But one door, at the far end of the hall, was closed. It looked like it had been closed for a long time. The paint chipped and faded, the doorknob rusted with age. Jessie approached it with a mixture of curiosity and unease. She reached for the doorknob, and the moment her fingers brushed it, a cold gust of air swept through the hallway, despite the lack of open windows. She hesitated, but the door creaked open with a groan, as though it had been waiting for her. The room was small and bare, the only furniture a dusty old rocking chair in the corner. There was a window that looked out over the field behind the house, but the night was so dark that she could barely make out anything beyond it. As Jessie stepped into the room, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't the chill of a draft. It was something else entirely. She couldn't explain it, but the room felt wrong, like she wasn't alone. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a small table near the rocking chair. There was something on it, an old photograph. She picked it up carefully, brushing away the dust that had settled on its surface. The photo was black and white, faded with age. It showed a young couple standing together in front of the house. They were smiling, their arms around each other, but there was something unsettling about their eyes. They were too wide, too hollow, as if they were staring into something beyond the camera. Jessie couldn't explain it, but the longer she looked at the photo, the more it made her feel uneasy. She placed the photo back on the table, her heart beginning to race. That was when she heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable, a soft scraping noise coming from behind her. She froze, the blood draining from her face. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was dragging itself across the floor. Jessie slowly turned around, her breath catching in her throat. The rocking chair, which had been still when she entered the room, was now gently rocking back and forth. The motion was slow at first, but it picked up speed, faster and faster, until the chair was rocking violently. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unnatural weight. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, stumbling over the old rug on the floor. That's when she saw it, an outline in the corner of the room near the window. A figure, pale and thin, standing just inside the darkness. Jessie's blood ran cold as she stared at it, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure was tall, its face hidden in shadow, but she could see its eyes, wide, hollow, and filled with an endless sadness. The figure took a slow step toward her, and Jessie's instincts kicked in. She ran. She didn't care how fast she was going, how loud her footsteps were as they pounded down the hallway. All she could think about was getting out of the house, away from that thing. When she reached the stairs, she nearly tripped, her hand grasping the railing for balance. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare see if the figure was following her. She could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She had to get out, had to leave. She reached the front door and yanked it open. The night air hit her like a slap in the face, but it didn't feel like relief. The cold was biting, and the wind howled through the empty yard as though the house itself were alive, angry that she was leaving. Jessie didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, but finally the engine roared to life and she sped away, not looking back. Her mind raced, replaying the events over and over. The photo, the rocking chair, the figure. It didn't make sense. None of it did. The next morning, Jessie couldn't bring herself to go back to the house. She avoided the road that led to it, kept her distance, and told herself it was all just her imagination. But when she spoke to the neighbors later that week, they told her something that chilled her to the bone. "That house," one of them said, "it's been empty for years. But there's a story, you know. They say that the family who lived there, they vanished without a trace. The husband and wife, gone. Just like that. No one ever knew what happened to them." Jessie's stomach dropped. The couple in the photo, could it have been them? Was that the man and woman she had seen in the picture? She didn't know, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped something terrible. She never went near the house again. It was eventually torn down, replaced with new homes, but Jessie could never forget the figure in the dark, the hollow eyes that seemed to follow her even after she left. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The small cottage had always been a dream for Caroline. Nestled in the quiet countryside, surrounded by a canopy of tall oaks and a bubbling creek nearby, it was the perfect escape from her stressful life in the city. She had saved for years to buy it, and when she finally moved in, it felt like the start of something new, something peaceful. But that peace was short-lived. It started innocently enough. Little things, barely noticeable at first, a door left open when she was certain she had closed it, lights flickering once or twice, the faintest hint of movement out of the corner of her eye. Caroline chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, moving was stressful, and her sleep had been restless since the first night she arrived. Then came the tapping. It was soft at first, a rhythmic sound at her bedroom window just after midnight. Tap, tap, tap. Caroline dismissed it as a branch brushing against the glass. The next morning, she examined the area outside the window. There were no branches anywhere near it. Confused but unwilling to let her imagination run wild, she returned inside and carried on with her day. The following night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Sitting up in bed, Caroline stared at the window. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the faint outline of something, or someone, standing just beyond the glass. Her heart pounded as she held her breath, unable to look away. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Just as she began to wonder if she had imagined it, the tapping resumed, faster this time. Caroline leapt out of bed, grabbed her phone, and turned on the flashlight. Pulling the curtains back in one swift motion, she shined the light onto the window. There was nothing there. Her hands were shaking as she locked the windows and drew the curtains tightly shut. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her ears straining to catch even the faintest sound, but the tapping didn't come back. at least not that night. The next few days were uneventful, and Caroline began to convince herself it had been an animal or some other logical explanation. She resumed her routine, unpacking boxes and settling into her new home. It wasn't until the following weekend that things took a darker turn. She was cleaning the kitchen when she noticed something odd. On the countertop was a knife she hadn't used. It was lying there, perfectly aligned with the edge of the counter. Caroline frowned. She was meticulous about keeping her kitchen organized and knew she hadn't taken that knife out. Trying to brush off the unease creeping up her spine, she put it back in the drawer and went about her day. That night, as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone, she heard it again. Tap, 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 tap. This time it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from the closet. Caroline froze, her breath catching in her throat. The closet door was slightly ajar, just as she had left it, but the sound was unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was knocking on the inside of the door. Summoning all her courage, she reached for the bedside lamp and turned it on. The warm glow illuminated the room, chasing away the shadows, but the tapping continued. She stared at the closet, her hands gripping the blankets so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. Caroline waited, her heart hammering in her chest, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, she got out of bed and approached the closet. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. With a deep breath, she yanked it open. The closet was empty. She stood there for a moment, staring at the neatly hung clothes and the few boxes stacked on the floor. Shaking her head, she closed the door firmly and locked it for good measure. But the unease lingered, and sleep was impossible. The next morning, Caroline decided to investigate the history of the cottage. She drove into town and visited the local library, where an elderly librarian helped her dig through old records. What she found made her blood run cold. The cottage had once belonged to a woman named Margaret Holloway, who had lived there alone for nearly 30 years. She was known as a recluse, rarely seen in town, and rumors swirled about her being strange. One day, she simply vanished. Neighbors reported her missing after they hadn't seen her for weeks, but no trace of her was ever found. The only unusual thing noted in the investigation was that all the doors and windows had been locked from the inside. Caroline returned home with a heavy heart, the weight of the cottage's history pressing down on her. She tried to tell herself it was just an old house with an unfortunate past, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That night, she decided to stay up and see if anything happened. Armed with a cup of coffee and her phone, she sat in the living room, every light in the house turned on. Midnight came and went without incident. Just as she began to feel foolish, she heard it again. Tap! 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 This time, it was coming from the front door. Caroline's pulse quickened as she approached the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Summoning her courage, she flung the door open. There was no one there, but on the doorstep was something that made her stomach drop. A single, worn leather shoe. It was small, like a child's, and coated in a fine layer of dust. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands trembling. She didn't sleep that night or the next. The tapping grew more frequent, coming from different places, the walls, the floor, the windows. Sometimes she would hear faint whispers, just on the edge of comprehension. Other times, she would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The breaking point came a week later. Caroline was in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, when she saw it. In the mirror, just behind her, was the reflection of a woman. She was pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes staring directly at Caroline. Her mouth moved as though she were whispering something, but no sound came out. Caroline spun around, but the woman was gone. When she turned back to the mirror, the reflection was empty, just her own terrified face staring back. That was the last night Caroline spent in the cottage. She packed a bag and left without looking back, driving straight to a friend's house in the city. She never returned, leaving the rest of her belongings behind. The cottage was eventually sold again, and she made no effort to warn the new owners. But sometimes, late at night when Caroline is lying in bed, She hears it again. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When I was 10 years old, my family moved into a house that had been abandoned for years. It was an old colonial-style home on the outskirts of town, with paint peeling off the shutters and a porch that sagged under its own weight. My parents bought it cheap, convinced they could restore it to its former glory. The previous owners had left everything behind: furniture, clothes, and even old photo albums. They'd vanished, almost as if they had planned to come back, but never did. The first night we moved in, my sister Claire and I claimed our rooms on the second floor. Mine was at the end of the hall, a cozy corner room with a single window overlooking the backyard. Claire's was directly across from mine. We spent hours unpacking, excited about the new adventure, but as the sun set and the house fell silent, I began to feel uneasy. The air in my room felt heavier, almost as if someone was standing behind me, watching. I dismissed it as nerves. New house, new noises. Nothing unusual. A week later, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft scratching. It was faint, coming from somewhere near the window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and stared at the glass. The backyard was pitch black, but I could make out the silhouette of the large oak tree swaying in the wind. Convinced it was just a branch brushing against the house, I tried to go back to sleep, but the scratching didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and then it moved, shifting from the window to the corner of the room where my closet stood. "Claire?" I whispered, hoping my sister had wandered into my room for some reason. No answer. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the closet door, which was slightly ajar. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I thought I saw something. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, moving just inside the closet. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the blanket over my head, willing myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I told Claire about it. She laughed, brushing it off. "You're just being paranoid," she said. "Old houses make weird noises." But it didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, the scratching continued, always at night, always in my room. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, other times from the floorboards beneath my bed. My parents told me it was probably mice, but no traps ever caught anything. One night I woke up to a loud thump. The sound came from the attic, which was directly above my room. I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling. Another thump, followed by what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and dragging. I could hear the creak of the old wooden boards above me. I ran to my parents' room, shaking them awake. My dad groggily grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the attic, this muttering about squirrels or raccoons. Claire and I followed behind him, clutching each other tightly. The attic door was a pull-down ladder in the hallway, and as my dad climbed up, the air around us seemed to grow colder. "Nothing here," he called down after a few minutes of searching. "Probably just the wind." But when he came back down, his face was pale, and he didn't say another word about it. I later overheard him telling my mom he'd found something strange. An old rocking chair in the middle of the attic, facing the window. It hadn't been there when we first moved in. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of my closet door creaking open. My heart stopped. I stared at the door, which I always made sure to shut before going to bed. Slowly, it opened wider, revealing nothing but darkness inside. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. But the words were unmistakable. "Come here." I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, like something was holding me in place. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Come here." Finally, I found the strength to scream. My parents rushed in, flipping on the lights. I told them what had happened, but they just looked at each other, unsure of what to say. My dad checked the closet, but of course it was empty. After that, my parents decided to let me sleep in their room for a while. Claire teased me, saying I was acting like a baby, but I didn't care. I couldn't stand being in that room alone anymore. One night, as we were all asleep, Claire came running into my parents' room, her face pale and tears streaming down her cheeks. She said she'd woken up to find someone standing at the foot of her bed, a woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. The woman didn't move or speak. She just stared at Claire before vanishing into thin air. That was the breaking point for my parents. The next morning, my dad called a priest to bless the house. The priest walked through every room, sprinkling holy water and murmuring prayers. When he reached the attic, he paused at the door, his face grim. He said a longer prayer there before continuing. For a while, things seemed to settle down. The noises stopped, and the house felt lighter, less oppressive. But then, one night, as we were sitting in the living room watching TV, the power went out. My dad went to check the breaker, and Claire and I stayed huddled together on the couch. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the stairs. The room grew icy cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Claire grabbed my hand, her grip tight. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. At the base of the stairs stood a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It was the woman Claire had described, the one with the hollow eyes. She stared at us for what felt like an eternity before slowly turning and walking toward the kitchen. My mom screamed, and my dad came running back into the house, yelling for us to get out. We left that night and never went back. My parents sold the house to a developer who planned to tear it down. I don't know if they ever did. I've never been able to bring myself to drive past it again. Sometimes I still dream about that house. In my dreams, I'm standing in the attic, staring at the rocking chair as it slowly rocks back and forth, and every time I hear the whisper, calling me back. Come here.
Story number 7.
The house on Pine Hollow Road wasn't a mansion or even a particularly remarkable home. It was an old 2-story colonial with peeling white paint and dark green shutters. Its charm was subtle, cozy, unassuming, and cheap enough to tempt Lucas and Emma, a young couple looking for their first home. They had been warned about its history. The realtor mentioned it briefly, as required by law. A man had died there years ago. The details were vague, and the price was too good to pass up. They dismissed it as local gossip meant to scare newcomers. From the moment they moved in, Emma felt uneasy. It was little things at first. Shadows that didn't seem to belong, the faint smell of tobacco despite neither of them smoking, and an odd draft that always lingered in the upstairs hallway. Lucas laughed it off, calling it the quirks of an old house, but Emma wasn't so sure. The first real incident happened late one night. Emma woke up suddenly, her throat dry. She rolled over to see Lucas fast asleep, his soft snores steady and calm. She reached for her phone to check the time, 2:33 a.m., then got up to grab a glass of water. As she walked down the stairs, the creak of the old wood seemed louder than usual, echoing in the stillness of the house. The kitchen was dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the window. She poured her water, sipped it slowly, and was about to head back to bed when she noticed something on the counter. It was a single cigarette. Emma frowned, setting her glass down. She stared at the cigarette, her mind racing. They didn't smoke, and she had cleaned the kitchen thoroughly just hours ago. It hadn't been there before. Her chest tightened as she reached out, hesitant, and touched it. It felt real enough, dry, fragile. The faint sound of footsteps broke her focus. They were coming from upstairs. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and headed toward their bedroom. "Lucas?" she called out, her voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. Gripping the edge of the counter, Emma waited for some kind of response. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, until she finally worked up the courage to move. She crept back upstairs, her bare feet silent on the wooden steps. When she reached the bedroom, she found Lucas still asleep, undisturbed. She didn't mention the cigarette or the footsteps the next morning. She didn't want to sound crazy, though her unease lingered. She convinced herself it had to be stress or an overactive imagination. But things only got worse. A few days later, while Lucas was at work, Emma was home alone unpacking boxes in the living room. She had music playing softly to keep her company when she heard the faint hum of a man's voice. It was coming from upstairs. She turned off the music and stood frozen, listening. The humming continued, a low melodic tune that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't a song she recognized, but it felt familiar in an unsettling way. Slowly, she made her way to the staircase, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The humming stopped. Emma stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the dark hallway. She felt an overwhelming urge to leave the house, but forced herself to push forward. She climbed the stairs cautiously, one creaking step at a time. When she reached the top, the hallway was empty, just as it had been before. But the smell of tobacco was stronger now, thick and choking. She backed away, retreating to the safety of the living room. That evening, when Lucas came home, she told him everything. He listened patiently but remained skeptical. Emma, it's an old house. Houses like this make noises. Pipes creak, air drafts hum. You're just spooking yourself, he said with a reassuring smile. She wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The tipping point came a week later. It was late at night, and the couple was watching TV in the living room when they heard it, a loud crash from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. Lucas jumped up immediately. "What the hell was that?" he said, already heading for the stairs. Emma grabbed his arm. "Don't go up there," she pleaded, her voice panicked. "We can't just ignore it," he said, pulling away. Reluctantly, Emma followed him. The two of them climbed the stairs together, their footsteps hesitant. At the top, they found nothing out of place. The hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms and bathroom all closed. But the smell of tobacco was overpowering, making Emma gag. They opened the door to the guest room, where the crash seemed to have come from. The room was untouched, the bed neatly made, the furniture undisturbed, but in the center of the floor lay a shattered picture frame. It wasn't one they owned. The frame held a black and white photograph of a man sitting in a worn armchair, a cigarette in hand. He stared directly into the camera, his expression blank, but his eyes cold and piercing. Emma and Lucas exchanged a terrified glance. Neither of them had seen the photograph before. That night, they slept in the living room with all the lights on. The next morning, Lucas decided to dig deeper into the house's history. He went to the local records office, determined to find out more about the man who had died there. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. The previous owner, a man named Harold Grayson, had lived in the house for over 50 years. He was a heavy smoker, known for his reclusive nature and temper. Neighbors reported hearing arguments and shouting coming from the house late at night, even though Harold lived alone. One day, he was found dead in his armchair, a cigarette still burning in his hand. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but rumors swirled that something more sinister had happened. Lucas returned home, pale and shaken. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. Emma didn't argue. They packed what they could and stayed in a motel that night. The house was listed for sale the next day, but they couldn't escape the feeling that Harold Grayson wasn't done with them. Even now, in their new apartment miles away, Emma sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night to the faint smell of tobacco. And when she does, she knows better than to look toward the corner of the room where she's sure she can feel someone watching her. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
It was the summer of 1997 when my Uncle Sam bought an old farmhouse on the edge of town. It sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by acres of overgrown fields and dense woods. The property had been on the market for years. Abandoned after the previous owner, a widower named Mr. Fletcher, passed away. Sam was excited to fix the place up, convinced he could turn it into something special. He invited me to stay with him that summer. I was 17 and looking for a break from my parents. The house was huge, with creaky wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and a faint scent of mildew. The furniture left behind by Mr. Fletcher was still there, dusty chairs, an old upright piano, and a grandfather clock that didn't work anymore. Sam joked that it was a fixer-upper, but even he seemed uneasy sometimes. On my first night, I noticed something strange. My bedroom was at the far end of the second floor, and as I lay in bed, I heard faint footsteps above me. The problem was, there was no third floor, just the attic. I brushed it off, assuming it was animals or my imagination, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to Sam. He laughed it off. "Probably squirrels," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. He handed me a flashlight and told me to check the attic if it happened again. I agreed, though the thought of going up there alone didn't sit well with me. A few nights later, I heard the footsteps again. They started faint, as if someone were pacing back and forth. Then they grew louder, more deliberate. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and crept up the narrow staircase to the attic. The door at the top was old and warped, and it groaned loudly as I pushed it open. The attic was stiflingly hot and filled with junk, boxes, old furniture, and what looked like a child's rocking horse. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, my skin crawling with unease. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickly shut the door and went back to bed, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next day, Sam and I decided to start clearing out the house. While going through the attic, we found a small wooden box tucked away in a corner. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal. The photos were black and white, showing a family, a man, a woman, and a young girl, no older than 6 or 7. The girl was always smiling, but there was something unsettling about her eyes, like she was looking straight through the camera. Sam handed me the journal. "Why don't you take a look? Might be interesting." I spent the evening reading it. The journal belonged to Mr. Fletcher, and most of the entries were mundane. Notes about the weather, repairs he'd made around the house, and memories of his late wife. But near the end, the tone shifted. His handwriting grew shaky, and the entries became more erratic. "Something is wrong with Emily. She keeps saying she hears someone calling her name. Last night, I found her in the attic, sitting on that damn rocking horse, talking to someone who wasn't there. She said it was the woman in the shadows." I locked the attic door, but she still finds a way to get up there. I don't know what to do. She screams when I try to stop her. The woman is getting stronger. I can feel her watching me too. I've tried to leave, but I can't. She won't let us go. The final entry was barely legible. "Emily is gone. The woman took her. I hear her laughing at night. She says I'll never leave this house." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to believe it was the ramblings of a grieving man, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. That night, I woke up to the sound of the grandfather clock chiming. It hadn't worked since we moved in, but now it was ringing, loud and clear. I glanced at my alarm clock, 3:03 a.m. The air in my room felt heavy, and I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they weren't above me. They were coming down the hall, slow and deliberate. I held my breath as the floorboards creaked outside my door. Then the knob began to turn. "Sam?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The door opened a crack, and I saw nothing, just darkness. But then I felt it, a cold rush of air like something had brushed past me. My body froze, and for a moment, I couldn't move or even scream. When I finally regained control, I ran to Sam's room, shaking him awake. He groggily asked what was wrong, and I told him everything. His face went pale, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "We need to leave," he said, grabbing his car keys. "Right now." We drove into town and checked into a motel. As we sat on the edge of the bed, Sam told me something he hadn't shared before. "Before I bought the house, I asked around about Mr. Fletcher. People said his daughter Emily disappeared when she was 7. The police searched everywhere but never found her. Fletcher claimed she was taken, but no one believed him. They thought he lost his mind after his wife died." "Taken by who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The woman," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever she is." The next morning, we returned to the house to pack up our things. Sam wanted to sell the place, even if it meant taking a loss. As we loaded boxes into the car, I felt an overwhelming urge to go back inside. I don't know why, I just felt like I had to. I climbed the stairs to the attic one last time. The rocking horse was gone, but in its place was a single photograph lying on the floor. It was one of the family pictures, but this time the little girl wasn't smiling. Her face was twisted in fear, and standing behind her was a shadowy figure, barely visible but unmistakably there. I ran out of the house, clutching the photo, and never looked back. Sam sold the property a month later. The new owners gutted the place and turned it into a rental. I don't know if they ever experienced anything, but I still have nightmares about that house. Sometimes I hear the creak of footsteps or the faint chime of a clock that no longer exists. And in those dreams, I always see her, the woman in the shadows, standing at the top of the stairs, watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was a bitterly cold November evening when Sarah moved into her new apartment. The building was old, its brick facade weathered and worn. It was the kind of place that whispered of history, creaky wooden floors, tall windows that rattled in the wind, and the faint scent of must that seemed embedded in the walls. The price had been too good to pass up, though, and Sarah was eager for a fresh start after her breakup. She told herself the charm of the place would outweigh its quirks. The first night passed uneventfully, though Sarah didn't sleep well. She chalked it up to the new surroundings. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought she heard faint whispers. She couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur of voices. She froze, her ears straining. The sound seemed to come from the living room, just beyond her bedroom door. Must be the neighbors, she told herself, though she hadn't heard a sound from them before. The next morning, she asked the elderly woman who lived in the unit below her if noise carried through the walls. The woman smiled politely and shook her head. "It's a quiet building," she said. "That's why I've stayed here so long. I never hear anyone." Sarah nodded and forced a smile, trying not to let her discomfort show. She spent the rest of the day unpacking, trying to push the previous night out of her mind. That evening, as she cooked dinner, Sarah noticed something strange. One of the kitchen cabinets, one she hadn't used, was slightly open. Frowning, she reached up to close it, only to feel a sudden, sharp chill. It was as if an icy draft had blown past her, though all the windows were closed. Shaking it off, she returned to cooking, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was standing just behind her. Later that night, as Sarah settled into bed, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more distinct. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Her chest tightened as she stared at the closed bedroom door. Her rational mind told her it had to be the wind or perhaps the pipes in the old building, but her gut told her otherwise. She pulled the covers over her head like a child hiding from a monster. The whispers continued for what felt like hours before they finally faded into silence. Exhausted and shaken, Sarah eventually drifted off to sleep. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Objects moved when she wasn't looking. A mug she'd left on the counter ended up on the floor. Her keys, always kept on the hook by the door, were found in the bathroom sink. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision, and that icy chill seemed to follow her from room to room. Sarah began to feel like a stranger in her own home, constantly on edge. One evening, she decided to do some research. Pulling out her laptop, she searched for information about the building. What she found made her stomach drop. The building had a dark history. In the 1920s, it had been a boarding house. One of the tenants, a man named Edward Whitaker, had been a reclusive artist known for his temper. He lived on the top floor, Sarah's floor. Rumor had it that Edward became increasingly paranoid in his later years, convinced that someone was after him. He was found dead in his apartment, slumped over his easel with no signs of foul play. Some claimed it was a heart attack. Others whispered it was something far darker. Sarah stared at the screen, her hands trembling. It was probably just an old ghost story, she told herself. But the strange occurrences in her apartment suddenly felt much more sinister. That night, she decided to confront whatever was happening. She wasn't sure what she believed, but she was done feeling afraid. She lit a few candles, sat cross-legged on the living room floor, and spoke into the empty air. "Edward, if you're here, I don't mean you any harm," she said, her voice shaking. "This is my home now, and I just want peace. If you need something, tell me." The room was silent. The only sound was the faint crackling of the candles. For a moment, Sarah felt foolish. Then she heard it, a soft, rasping breath, so close it sent chills down her spine. She froze, her heart pounding. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of paint thinner filled her nostrils. She felt a presence behind her, heavy and oppressive. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay still. "What do you want?" she whispered. The candles flickered violently, and a single word seemed to form in the back of her mind, as if whispered directly into her thoughts. "Help." Sarah's breath caught. "How?" she asked, her voice cracking. There was no response. The room slowly warmed, and the scent of paint thinner faded. The oppressive feeling lifted, leaving her shaken but determined. She had to figure out what Edward wanted. Over the next few days, Sarah scoured the apartment, searching for anything that might be connected to him. In a forgotten corner of the bedroom closet, she found it, an old wooden box covered in dust. Inside were photographs, sketches, and a small, leather-bound journal. The sketches were dark and chaotic, filled with shadowy figures and frantic scribbles. The journal was equally disturbing, detailing Edward's descent into paranoia. He wrote about feeling watched, hearing whispers, and seeing shadows in the corners of his vision. The final entry stopped Sarah cold. "They're here. I can't escape them. If anyone finds this, please forgive me." Her hands shook as she set the journal down. What had Edward seen? And was it still here? That night, Sarah had a vivid dream. She was standing in her living room, but it was different, brighter, cleaner, as if transported back in time. Edward was there, seated at an easel, painting furiously. He turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. "They won't leave me alone," he said, his voice trembling. "You have to make them go." "Who?" Sarah asked, but the room began to darken, the walls closing in. Shadowy figures emerged, their forms shifting and indistinct. Edward screamed, and Sarah jolted awake, gasping for air. She knew what she had to do. The next day, Sarah contacted a local historian and asked about the building's history. She learned that before it was a boarding house, the land had been the site of a small church that burned down in the late 1800s. Several parishioners had died in the fire, and their remains were never recovered. Sarah couldn't explain it, but she felt certain that the spirits of those who had died in the fire were still lingering, attached to the land. And Edward, in his isolation and sensitivity, had somehow become a target for their restless energy. She reached out to a spiritual medium who agreed to cleanse the apartment. The medium arrived that evening, a petite woman with a calm demeanor and a satchel of tools. She walked through the apartment, her expression growing more serious with each step. "There's a lot of pain here," she said softly. "Not just Edward, but others. They're trapped, confused. We need to help them move on." The medium performed a ritual, lighting sage and reciting prayers. She instructed Sarah to speak aloud, telling the spirits that it was time to leave, that they were free. The air grew heavy, the apartment filled with a low hum that made Sarah's ears ache. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The room felt lighter, warmer, as if a weight had been lifted. The medium smiled. "It's done," she said. "You should feel at peace now." And she did. The whispers, the cold drafts, the moving objects, all of it stopped after that night. Sarah stayed in the apartment, finally feeling at home. Every now and then, though, she swore she could smell a faint hint of paint thinner, as if Edward were still lingering, watching over her. But it no longer felt threatening. It felt protective. Story the end.
Story number 10.
When I was 22, I moved into a small apartment in an older building in the heart of the city. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with outdated fixtures and creaky floors. But it was mine, and I was excited to finally have a place of my own. The rent was surprisingly cheap, and I never questioned why. If I had known what I do now, I would have never signed that lease. The first time I noticed something odd was my second night there. I was unpacking late, the apartment filled with the soft hum of the radio I'd brought to keep me company. I had placed an old family photograph of my grandparents on the mantel above the fireplace, but when I turned around after unpacking another box, the photo was on the floor, face down. I thought maybe I had bumped the mantel or set it precariously, so I placed it back and didn't think much of it. But the little things kept happening. Lights flickered, even though the bulbs were brand new. Doors I swore I'd closed would be open when I came home. I would hear faint tapping on the walls at night, sometimes rhythmic, as if it were trying to communicate. I told myself it was just the quirks of an old building, bad wiring, uneven floors, pipes settling. Logical explanations helped me sleep. About a week later, I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone when I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft humming sound, like someone singing a lullaby. I froze, holding my breath, trying to make out the melody. It seemed to be coming from the living room. My immediate thought was that someone had left their TV on in the apartment next door, but as I sat up to listen, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. I got out of bed and walked into the living room, flipping on the light. Nothing was out of place, and the air felt still, almost too still. As I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The photograph of my grandparents was missing. It wasn't on the mantel, the floor, or anywhere nearby. I searched the entire apartment that night, but couldn't find it. The next morning, I chalked it up to exhaustion and brushed it off. That night, I double-checked all the doors and windows before bed, making sure they were locked. I even slid the chain lock across the front door for extra security. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud crash. My heart was racing as I bolted upright in bed. The sound had come from the kitchen. Grabbing my phone for light, I crept into the hallway. When I reached the kitchen, I saw the source of the noise. Every single cabinet door was wide open, and the contents, plates, cups, and glasses, were shattered on the floor. My chest tightened as I stared at the mess. There was no way this could have happened naturally. I wasn't even sure how I had slept through it. The apartment was silent, except for the faint sound of dripping. My gaze darted to the sink, but it wasn't the faucet. The dripping sound was coming from the ceiling. Looking up, I saw a dark stain spreading across the plaster. A drop of liquid splashed onto my arm, and I instinctively wiped it away. My fingers came away red. It wasn't water, it was blood. I scrambled back into the hallway, panic rising in my chest. That's when I saw the photograph. It was lying on the floor in front of my bedroom door, but something was different. The faces of my grandparents had been scratched out, replaced with 2 deep gouges in the paper. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the rest of it sitting in my car, parked a block away, with the engine running. The next day, I called the landlord, demanding answers. He seemed hesitant, evasive, but after I pressed him, he admitted that the previous tenant had moved out suddenly, claiming the apartment was haunted. "There's nothing wrong with the place," he said, his tone defensive. "Old buildings make noise and people have overactive imaginations." I didn't believe him, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I couldn't afford to break the lease, so I decided to stay, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. The humming came back, louder and more distinct. It always happened around 3 a.m., and it sounded closer each time, as if whoever or whatever was singing was moving through the apartment. Objects continued to disappear and reappear in strange places. The air often felt cold, even on warm nights, and the scent of something rotting would waft through the rooms, disappearing as quickly as it came. One night, I woke up to the feeling of pressure on my chest. My eyes snapped open, and I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, its features obscured by shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body felt paralyzed as it leaned closer, the humming growing louder in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The next morning, I found scratches on my chest, 3 long, parallel marks, as if from claws. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things and left that same day, crashing on a friend's couch while I figured out my next steps. A few weeks later, I met a neighbor who had lived in the building for years. When I told her about my experience, her face grew pale. "You were in apartment 2B, weren't you?" she asked. When I nodded, she continued, "That place has a history. Decades ago, a woman named Eleanor lived there. She was reclusive, never left the apartment. One night, the neighbors heard her screaming, but by the time they broke down the door, it was too late. She had taken her own life in the bedroom. People say she was humming a lullaby when they found her. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had never told anyone about the humming. I never went back to that building. I found a new place across town, a modern apartment with no history, no strange noises, and no shadows. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it again, that faint, haunting lullaby. And I wonder if Eleanor ever really let me go." Story the end.
Story number 11.
The night Sarah decided to visit her grandmother's old house, a biting chill had settled over the countryside. The property, located on the outskirts of town, had been vacant for years since her grandmother passed away. Yet it still stood resolute, shrouded in the quiet solitude of the surrounding woods. It wasn't her first time visiting, but tonight felt different. Sarah had inherited the house and planned to sell it, but something kept tugging at her to visit one last time. The memories were too vivid. Weekends spent in her grandmother's garden, the smell of baking bread wafting through the old kitchen, and her grandmother's warm, gentle laughter. The house was dark when Sarah arrived, illuminated only by the beams of her car's headlights. The once beautiful Victorian exterior had faded, and the paint was peeling, giving the home an eerie, abandoned look. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped inside. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and mildew. As Sarah made her way through the house, her footsteps echoed on the creaking floorboards. She paused in the kitchen, her beam of light settling on the rusted stove and the cracked ceramic sink. She could almost hear her grandmother humming while kneading dough at the counter. A pang of sadness tugged at her chest. "Just memories," she whispered to herself, shaking it off. She moved through the house, the flashlight illuminating the rooms she had known so well as a child. The parlor, once filled with cozy armchairs and shelves of books, was now empty and cold. The staircase groaned as she climbed it, leading her to the second floor where the bedrooms were. Her grandmother's room was untouched, just as she had left it. The bed was neatly made, and a porcelain vase sat on the nightstand. As Sarah stepped closer, she noticed something odd: the faint smell of lavender. It was her grandmother's favorite scent, the one she always wore. Sarah frowned and looked around. The house had been empty for years. There was no reason for the smell to linger. Shrugging it off as her imagination, Sarah decided to check the attic. Her grandmother had always warned her not to go up there as a child, calling it too dangerous, but curiosity got the better of her tonight. The attic door was stiff, but she managed to push it open, revealing a narrow set of stairs. The attic was colder than the rest of the house. Her flashlight swept across the room, revealing dusty boxes, old furniture draped in sheets, and cobwebs hanging from the rafters. As she explored, her foot nudged something on the floor. She looked down and saw a small wooden box. It was locked, but the lock was rusted and fragile. A quick tug broke it open. Inside, she found old photographs, faded and yellowed with age. They were of her grandmother as a young woman, standing with a man Sarah didn't recognize. They looked happy, but there was something about the man's expression that unsettled her. His eyes seemed too dark, his smile too forced. Among the photographs was a letter, its edges brittle and torn. Sarah unfolded it carefully and began to read. It was a letter from her grandmother, addressed to someone named Henry. The tone was desperate, pleading. "Henry, I can't keep doing this. The house feels wrong. I hear things at night, whispers, footsteps, the creak of the attic door opening on its own. I know it's you. Please, if you've forgiven me, let me be. I'm begging you to leave me in peace." Sarah's hands trembled as she lowered the letter. What had her grandmother meant? Who was Henry? A sudden noise made her freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. They were coming from below. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and growing louder. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. There was no response. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Sarah made her way down the attic stairs, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She paused at the bottom, listening. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. She scanned the hallway with her flashlight, the beam trembling in her unsteady hand. That's when she saw it. A shadow moving across the far end of the hall. It wasn't her shadow, it was too tall, too broad, and it moved independently of her flashlight's beam. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The shadow disappeared into her grandmother's bedroom. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the house, and never look back. But something compelled her to follow. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the faint hope of understanding what had terrified her grandmother so deeply. She approached the bedroom cautiously, her heart racing. The door was ajar, creaking softly as she pushed it open. The room was empty, just as it had been earlier. But the lavender scent was stronger now, almost overwhelming. Her flashlight swept across the room, landing on the nightstand. The porcelain vase had been moved. It now sat in the center of the bed, as if placed there deliberately. Sarah swallowed hard, stepping closer. As she reached for the vase, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the lavender scent was replaced by something rancid, like decaying flowers. Suddenly, the bedroom door slammed shut behind her. Sarah screamed, spinning around, but no one was there. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Panic set in as she yanked at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out," she cried, banging on the door. The room seemed to pulse around her, the shadows growing darker and more defined. And then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You shouldn't have come back." Sarah whirled around, her flashlight catching the edge of a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his eyes dark and hollow. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his expression was one of pure rage. She dropped the flashlight in her panic, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding her on all sides. In her desperation, Sarah remembered the letter. Her grandmother had begged for forgiveness. Maybe that was the key. "I'm sorry," she shouted into the darkness. "I don't know what happened, but I'm sorry. Please, leave me alone." The whispers stopped. The pressure in the room lifted, and the rancid smell faded. Sarah felt the doorknob turn under her hand, and the door swung open. She grabbed her flashlight and bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back. She didn't stop running until she was in her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, the house disappearing into the darkness behind her. Sarah never went back to her grandmother's house. She sold it to a developer without ever stepping foot inside again. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of the man in the corner. And when she wakes up, she swears she can still smell the faintest hint of lavender. Story the end.